Hello and welcome to the Beyond Biotech podcast number 98. I'm Jim Cornell and this is the weekly podcast from Labiotech. This week's podcast is brought to you by KBI Biopharma. KBI Biopharma is a global contract development and manufacturing organization that provides next-generation biologics development and manufacturing services to over 500 customers. With 6 sites across Europe and the United States, KBI Biopharma brings biotech innovations from cell line development through to commercial manufacturing. They invite you to come to KBI Biopharma's facility in Geneva, Switzerland on June the 27th to join the discussion on solving biotherapeutic challenges. Register at kbibiopharma.com/conferences. This week on the podcast, we are discussing novel treatments of rare pediatric diseases in a conversation with Dan Williams, CEO, Executive Director and co-founder of Synaptix Bio. Synaptix Bio is working on developing treatments for severe leukodystrophies. All right, well, thanks, Dan, for being involved in the podcast. And so to get things started, I wonder if first you could tell us a bit about the company.
Yeah, so Synaptix Bio was officially founded 3 years ago in April 2021 by 4 co-founders. There's myself, there's a lady called Michelle, or Dr. Michelle Teng, who actually is a parent of a patient with HABC, which is hypomyelination with atrophy of the basal ganglia and cerebellum. One of the co-founders has a huge amount of experience with setting up biotech companies and running biotech companies. And the 4th one is an investor who also has a lot of experience with really founding and getting companies off the ground and moving. We are a virtual company. And by virtual, what I mean by that is we don't have very many employees. So we have the board, which sit and manage things as boards should. And then as myself, as a full-time employee, I have a scientist who is also a full-time employee, and I have a person on the medical team as well. And between us, what we do is we manage all of the work. So we outsource everything with the idea that we can review the science, we can manage and direct where things go and manage either CROs, contract research organizations and clinical research organizations, manufacturing organizations as well to do the work that we need to have done. And then we bring the data back in, review the data, figure out where we need to go next. And it's a constant kind of cycle through. We get some data in, we review it, we design experiments and send the work out again. The company really got moving when we got the license to commercialize a therapy from the Children's Hospital in Philadelphia. We got that license fairly early on, which allows us to develop therapies in this particular area, so top 4A leukodystrophy and HABC. And also allows us to use some of their data that they had previously where they had started to do the research. And it was with that I was then able to use the information that I gained on what could be done commercially to then raise money. And over the 3 years, we've raised around 13 million altogether to push into research and development and then onwards to clinical trials. There's a really nice background story to how this kind of came about as well. I've mentioned Michelle Teng, who is the parent of the patient. They were looking for ways to accelerate treatments and accelerate research, and they very, very closely, were talking to and linked with a particular lab at CHOP, the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. Michelle, with 3 other parents, set up a foundation, a charity, and they raised money, which they then sent across, which then helped the research move forward. And it was a conversation between her and one of the other co-founders that really came to the conclusion that actually a charity can only raise so much money, and the tens of millions that are required to do development really needs to come from investors. That's where I got involved, was thinking about the commercial proposition and setting the company up.
I guess we're going to be talking about some specific rare diseases today, but I wonder if maybe to set the scene, and obviously not an exact number, but what's the definition of a rare disease and how many are there and how many kind of are pediatric out of that big picture of rare diseases?
There's a couple of different definitions depending on where you are, but I think the main definition, which comes from the World Health Organization, is that a rare disease is a disease that affects 1 in 2,000 people. The NHS also go with that. In the US, it's thought of as being a disease that affects less than 200,000 people within the US. But as you can see, we're getting into small numbers of people that have these diseases. And then you have a massive scale. Some will affect 1 in 2,000. Some will be even rarer than that. The disease that we're looking at is somewhere between 1 in 85,000 and 1 in 150,000, which is classed as being ultra rare. Rare diseases themselves, how many are there? Again, there's different numbers that are thrown around, but I would say there's around 7,000 diseases that are really known, particularly in the UK, 7,000 affecting around 3.5 million people. There's slightly different numbers that are thrown out in the States, but it gives you a good idea of the number of diseases that are out there. The actual causes of the diseases, or the pathology of the diseases, we're starting to find that a high number of them are actually genetic. And I think it's around 80% of them tend to be genetic. And 70% of these rare diseases tend to present in children as well. The problem with some of these rare diseases is that they have a high mortality rate. So the children tend to die quite early of these diseases. And the issue that is very difficult with this is that diagnosis can be extremely difficult as well. So if you've got children that die very early, and it's very difficult to diagnose them, sometimes the diagnosis is not really going to get them to anywhere where they can be treated. And then the other issue is that there's not very many treatments for a number of them. I think there's only roughly around 10% of rare diseases in general have some sort of treatment. Otherwise, it's treatment of symptoms, really, and trying to improve quality of life for those patients.
So when it comes to the rare disease that you're looking at, or some of the rare diseases that have treatments already, how do you approach the entire pathway of developing a treatment? Because as you said, quite often children are dying young and it doesn't really give an opportunity for diagnosis or study.
Yeah, so diagnosis is a big thing. And I think the advent of sequencing is really helping. The issue is, I think now, that there has to be an awareness of a lot of these diseases, both at a public level and within the medical profession as well. And of course, the issue is always going to be that you can't know everything and you can't know what's going on with every patient that comes in. But if there's more information that can come from genetic sequencing, then these diseases can be picked up earlier, or there's the possibility that they could be picked up earlier. To be able to pick up the diseases, you have to understand the disease in the first place. And you have to have a good idea of not just what the visual symptoms are, but actually what is the molecular causes of these things. What are the mutations that you're looking for? Which ones will really affect those patients? It's a very difficult thing to be able to do. There are a number of initiatives out there that allow sequencing. It's coming in earlier, and people are being sequenced earlier within the presentation of their diseases, which will give a really good idea of how to move treatment forward. So that's the big thing, I think, is if we can get a lot more sequencing done and understanding done, then perhaps these things can be tackled earlier.
You mentioned 7,000 rare diseases, and again, it's impossible to give a number, and it's also very difficult because there will be a range of rare diseases that have treatments that range from extremely effective to not very effective. But how many of those 7,000 have treatments or have people working towards treatment?
I don't know about working towards treatment, but I can tell you that at least through the FDA approved systems and drugs that are available, there's about 10%, I think, are really targeted at the moment, which is not a lot. Difficult to say the effectiveness of some of these treatments as well, simply because the effectiveness of some of these drugs will depend on the stage that the disease is at within the patients, and if they are quite well progressed and it's very, very severe, then sometimes some of these treatments won't work quite as well as if they're not as far progressed. It's very difficult to say. But the drugs that are out there through the FDA, they will have been through clinical trials and they will have seen positive results from them. So there is obviously a benefit from having them. But there's a lot of rare diseases where there is either no research that's going on, or they're not recognized, or it's just simply not understood. The mechanisms that the disease works by, and therefore developing a therapy is going to be a little way off until that's done.
Obviously, again, you can't speak to every rare disease, although when you mentioned 10%, 700 out of 7,000 leaves an awful lot of room for companies to get involved. What is the space looking like for the development of new treatments for rare diseases right now?
As I'm seeing, there are a number of companies that are getting involved in rare diseases, and there's a lot of work that is being done in a number of different areas and different disease types. And the companies that are getting involved range right the way through from large pharma down to small biotechs, which is great. And there's obviously research that goes on in universities, and if they're like us, we have kind of latched onto a rare disease and a technology that works in that disease, and we're taking it through the development, which I believe that biotech companies are quite good at, doing that research, early development work, and through to early clinical work. So I'm seeing that the field is getting bigger and it's getting better, and a lot, more things are being targeted. But my experience over the last 3 years has really been that you need a commercial proposition at the end of the day as well for a biotech, and you raise money against that. And it can be extremely difficult to make that argument and actually raise money to be able to do it. And it's one of those things that's very difficult to do. But there are some incentives out there. There are orphan drug incentives. There's things like the rare pediatric designations and priority review vouchers in the States that really do help, with various tax incentives. They help with actually raising money, and they help you on your way towards doing the development work. And it's these things that will keep companies doing this and will keep companies interested and involved. That, and there's some fantastic science out there, I have to say. There is some brilliant science, and you need the science to be able to move things forward.
And I guess you were mentioning that a lot of these diseases are genetic, so that kind of leads people in a certain direction anyway.
I think that a number of companies that specialize in particular areas will pick up on some of these rare diseases. So if you are a gene therapy company and you have a platform, then slotting one of these diseases into your platform, becomes very attractive to do as well. I think that a lot of companies have developed their platforms and are taking them on, which is really leading to a number of new projects that are coming out, which is quite exciting as well. And actually potentially partnerships as well.
You mentioned the fact that the fundraising can be challenging, and also you mentioned that some of the larger pharma companies are getting involved. Is there kind of the possibility or the potential for the lower numbers of people suffering from any particular rare disease to adversely affect both fundraising and also the attractiveness for big companies to get involved if they're not going to be selling it to millions and millions of patients?
So having a market is something that, and I wouldn't say just big pharma, it's investment companies, so venture capital companies, etc., are looking for. And they're looking for ways to get a return on their investment, potentially make some profit on their investment. And it is a larger risk for them to fund a company that potentially has a lower market And I think what you find then is that the prices of the treatments actually go up and they become more and more expensive because they're expensive to develop anyway, because there's very few numbers of patients out there. But then, the markets are so small that the risks are extremely high. I think the way that pharma fund it can be quite different, and they may not be, but they still have to take into consideration the markets as well. And it's something that you have to have a commercial proposition for at the end of the day. And when you're looking at a disease that maybe has 200 patients, it's going to be very, very difficult to say there's a market out there. But my feeling is still that we are heading towards trying to commercialize something so that there is a therapy for patients. And it's something that it is possible to do, and it's possible to do with a lot of the incentives that are out there that regulatory bodies and governments actually give. For instance, grants. There are grants that really help doing the development, and they're non-dilutive as well. And when you have the grants and you have that due diligence done on a grant, does help investors actually kind of step in and see that what you're doing has a potential that's there.
And I guess there are also some diseases whereby what you're working on may be applicable in other areas, so it has more than just one potential use.
Yeah, and as I mentioned, there are companies that have platforms, and if you you can develop a platform in a particular area, and if you can modify that platform to then enable treatment of another disease, then that really helps, because that just builds your market. We're looking at trying to develop things for type 4A leukodystrophy that I mentioned earlier on, and there's 4 diseases according to the FDA that are within that. So essentially, we're developing for one, and we'll use all of that learning to develop for another one. And we have the potential to really take the incentives on 2 different areas, which will then drive the company forward. I haven't mentioned it in full, but there's a thing called the priority review vouchers, which if we get to a point of a conditional biological license application for one of the drugs, we can potentially get a priority review voucher, which will either accelerate us to market, or we can sell that, which we can then plow the money from it back into research. These things are extremely important for rare diseases, and it's not really a true exit, as it were, but it is a point that actually you get reinvestment back into the company from being able to sell that voucher to then be able to move other things forward, whether that be with your one molecule or your platform.
You're working on that treatment for HABC. I wonder if you could tell me a bit more specifically about that disease and what it is and how common, etc.
HABC is hypomyelination with atrophy of the basal ganglia and cerebellum. The disease affects a particular protein, which is a tubulin 4A, for short, TUB4A, and is a leukodystrophy. So it affects the white matter of the brain, which essentially is the myelination of certain areas of the brain, the basal ganglia and cerebellum. And the mutations in the TUB4A gene affect the deposition of myelin on nerves within those particular areas, which then lead to the symptoms that you see. And those symptoms tend to be things like learning difficulties, motor skills, problems with walking, sitting, eating, etc. It's upper neuron dysfunction, delayed motor development. A number of the patients have things like epilepsy. They may require a gastric tube to eat with. A lot of them have motor regression as well. And it's neurodegenerative. So there's almost a scale of severity, and at one end of that scale, you'll have babies that are born and that disease shows up quite quickly, and they don't really get to the point of being able to support themselves. And then there's another form of the disease where the children actually develop and they then start missing developmental markers, and you notice things like their gait has changed, or there's certain issues that you start to see, and then they start to go downhill and they show more and more problems. It is a very, very rare disease. It's estimated somewhere between 1 in 85,000 and 1 in 150,000 patients, so per population. I think the really difficult thing with this, and with a number of other rare diseases, is that there isn't huge amounts of research and information out there about how many patients there actually are. We've gone back through the literature and we've seen everything from there are 200 patients worldwide through to it makes up 9% of leukodystrophies, which kind of gives an idea of at least 1,600 new births. And then you kind of go, well, the patients live 10, 15 years, which then multiplies that up. So 16,000 patients worldwide, possibly. The research and the funding for the research to actually really tell that is just not there yet. I can certainly say that what we found is there's far more in the UK than we ever expected based on the 200 number worldwide. And there's a lot of people suffering with this here. There's a lot in Europe as well that, since starting the company have contacted us. So I'm pretty sure the numbers are actually higher than what is published. Let me go into the mechanism of the disease a little bit, actually, because I can move from there into what we're looking at to try and develop a therapy. So I mentioned it's mutations in a particular gene, the gene for tubulin, and particular tubulin 4A, which is found in those specific regions, the basal ganglia and cerebellum. And what that produces is a abnormal protein, and that abnormal protein has a gain of function. And what that protein is involved with is it's involved with making parts of the cytoskeleton. And with that abnormal structure of the cytoskeleton, you don't get proper lipid transport or protein transport, so you don't get full deposition of the proteins and things required to form myelin, and therefore you don't get the myelin sheath around the nerves, and therefore you don't get fast action potentials working properly. And the therapy that we are developing involves I'd say knockout. Because it's not really a knockout, it's not a gene therapy, it works at the mRNA level. And what it does is it binds to the mRNA and then recruits in RNase H, which then destroys that particular message. And it's an antisense oligonucleotide that we're developing. And by knocking out that message, other forms of tubulin can then step in. And although we don't have the data showing that they step in, the hypothesis is that they step in and actually replace the tubulin 4A, which then allows normal functioning within those oligodendrocytes, which then allows deposition of myelin.
Are there any current treatments?
Not really. There's nothing really out there that target the disease itself. I think, there are other people that are working on ways of doing this, but there's nothing that's on the market and nothing that is out there that really targets the cause of the disease. The only real treatments are symptomatic, and they involve things like physical therapies, gastric tubes. There's various corrective surgery that can be done to try and help as well. And various drugs that are there to help with things like motor skills, epilepsy, etc. But it's actually just treatment of symptoms. It's not targeting the disease.
As far as clinical trials goes, is it difficult to, where are you at with clinical trials first?
So we are still in the development phases. So we have a number of molecules, and some of those molecules look very good. But there are a number of steps that we need to go through before we can get into the clinical trials. We are still developing. We've got advice from regulators of what we need to do. I think to get to clinical trials is reasonably difficult, and quite rightly so. They're quite stringent things that we need to go through. So we need to go through a number of different models for toxicology. Of course, you need to show some sort of efficacy in models. You've got your biodistribution and pharmacokinetics as well. And then on top of that, you have to do the manufacturing and make sure that everything is to GMP and correct for treatment. So we are right in the middle of doing that at the moment. The other side of it is that you have the clinical preparation, which is really pulling together a protocol and figuring out how to treat the patients, how to dose the drug, which patients are going to be effective within your trial, what to look for. And I think the real difficulty here for us is that we can't follow what someone else has done necessarily. We can look at other diseases that are similar, but no one's really done this disease in clinical trials. So we're kind of figuring that out right from the very beginning. But we are coming up with our protocol, and we're talking to a number of key opinion leaders to really get all of the information that we need to be able to do that. We always set out right from the very beginning to try and do this as quickly as we possibly can, because we recognise the need to get a treatment out there.
And with this and with some of the other extremely rare diseases, whether it's pediatric or in adults, are the sheer numbers of people that have this condition a barrier to clinical trials? Because obviously for COVID, you could pick anybody, but for this, the pool of people that you can have a clinical trial with is very small to start with.
Yeah, so this is where the clinical trial design is extremely important, and really understanding what you're going to look for, within those patients is very important, because you are going to go into a clinical trial in a rare disease knowing that recruitment's going to be difficult and recruitment might take a long time. If you have a really good design, there are a number of regulatory things that allow you to be able to test on smaller numbers of patients. And if you have everything set up ready to get a good idea of what you're looking for from the trial, you can go into some of these trials with lower numbers. You can get fast track designations in the States. You can move things very quickly, but you will probably have to do some follow-on studies as well. And I think that the mechanisms that are put in place to allow you to move quickly through clinical trials also helps with the funding side of things. For instance, there's the potential to design something that we could walk into a small number of patients to move towards a very quick BLA that will be conditional on us going out and getting more information from actually treating post BLA, which will then allow us to get to the priority review vouchers quicker, which then brings money back in, which allows us to do some of those bigger studies. So there's a number of things out there that help you move forward, but at the end of the day, you can't do studies where there are hundreds and hundreds of patients, because there aren't hundreds of patients out there. You've also got to take into consideration the fact that they're pediatric, so they have to get there and back, and that's going to be very difficult on the families. So you've got to make that very as easy as possible. Yeah, so there's a lot of things you need to take into consideration, but you can do that through a very good design of the study.
A very wide-ranging discussion there, and let's hope some of those thousands of rare diseases can be beaten in the future, hopefully in the not-too-distant future. And just a quick reminder that this week's podcast was brought to you by KBI Biopharma. KBI Biopharma is a global contract development and manufacturing organization that provides next-generation biologics development and manufacturing services to over 500 customers. With 6 sites across Europe and the United States, KBI Biopharma brings biotech innovations from cell line development through to commercial manufacturing. They invite you to come to KBI Biopharma's facility in Geneva, Switzerland on June the 27th to join the discussion on solving biotherapeutic challenges. Register today at kbibopharma.com/conferences. And don't forget to check out the latest news and articles over at Labiotech.eu, and I hope wherever in the world you are, you have a great week ahead. Thanks for listening, and I hope you'll join us again next time for another Beyond Biotech.